Hey everyone, welcome to today's webinar. Happy to see Ginger and Tammy in the building. We'll give folks a chance to join and start in just a minute. Welcome to folks just joining. In classic Gwen's Girls model, we are a sanctuary model. And so I ask that you introduce yourself in the chat and share one word to describe how you're feeling today. My name is Tashara Halyard. I am the Gwen's Girls and BGEA Research Coordinator, and I am feeling elevated today. All right, it is 1:03, so I think we should get started. Amy, if you can continue to welcome people in, I would appreciate it. Thank you. Once again, my name is Tashara Halyard. I am the Gwen's Girls and the Black Girls Equity Alliance Research Coordinator. In that role, I have the pleasure of putting together our She Matters webinar series, and today's webinar is part of that series all around Title IX. It will also be recorded, and so if you can't stay for the entire time, we totally understand that. The webinar will be housed over on our YouTube page and also on our website once it wraps up. But I'm excited because we have some very esteemed guests today to talk about this important piece of legislation. For folks who may not be familiar, Title IX was passed in 1972 to prevent sex discrimination in schools receiving federal funding. It has had many ups and downs, and I think Shawali will talk to us about that, especially under the previous administration. But today we have come far, but yet still have a long way to go. And so we thought that this conversation would be great to have with local and national advocates on the ground doing the work. And so we have with us Katie Pope, who is the Associate Vice Chancellor of Civil Rights and Title IX at the University of Pittsburgh. Welcome, Katie. We have Shawali Patel, who is an attorney at the National Women's Law Center. And we have Kenyora Parham, who is the Executive Director of End Rape on Campus. And you all are just going to be so excited to hear more about her work. I know it definitely inspired me. So today's conversation, for folks who don't know is, or who has not participated in one of our webinars in the past, is going to be just that, very conversational, discussion based. If you have a question or a comment, do not hesitate to raise your hand using the hand raising feature, or to just drop it in the chat or Q&A box. We will have a Q&A towards the end. But we are going to start with Shawali to just situate Title IX for us, because I know for years I thought that the legislation was just around sports, right? I did not know exactly what it was. So please provide us with a brief overview of Title IX.
Yes, and first I wanted to say thank you so much. It's always an honor to be invited back to speak to your events with Gwen's Girls and the Black Girls Equity Alliance. So it's great to reconnect you and to be back in this space. So Title IX, as you mentioned earlier, was passed 50 years ago, and in 1972, which actually was the same year that the National Women's Law Center was founded, where I work. And so since then, we have been working on issues around Title IX enforcement and gender equity in education. And the statute itself is only 37 words long, but it broadly protects against sex discrimination in education. So this doesn't just mean athletics, although it does include athletics. It also covers recruitment, admissions, financial aid, scholarships, facilities and housing, course offerings and access to courses and programs and activities, counseling, health insurance benefits and services, other extracurricular activities in addition to athletics, employment, school climate, and harassment. And it also covers, and I think we might get to this later, pregnant parenting students. And Title IX also requires schools to have published anti-discrimination policies and a grievance process to address harassment, other forms of sex discrimination. It requires schools to have a Title IX coordinator. So this is the person who responsibility is to ensure that the school is complying with Title IX, that they have the policies in place to address sex discrimination, that employees understand how to respond to sex discrimination, including sexual harassment, and that students know where to go if their rights were violated. So it's again, a very broad law. Initially, I think a lot of people's understanding of Title IX was that it was focused on athletics, which is a huge piece of Title IX. There has been a lot of work over the decades that NWLC has also been involved in ensuring that schools were providing equal opportunities and resources to girls and boys sports. And at one time in the past, we were filing a lot of complaints with the Department of Education to ensure that that was happening. And then over the last decade, and I know I'll get into this more, there has been much more attention paid to how Title IX requires schools to take steps to address sex-based harassment, including sexual harassment, and to protect students who've experienced it in their access to education.
Thank you, and we certainly will get into that. I just want to lift up our health and wellness co-convener, Dr. Brittany Brinkman is with us today, and I know we have done some work around sexual harassment that hopefully Brittany will feel comfortable sharing with us at some point. So you mentioned this idea of it just being around athletics as a common misconception. Any other misconceptions that you all have seen in your 50 years of work around the legislation?
I'll get started. So I think that's definitely one common misconception. Another is that it only protects, like this, having this narrow understanding of what sex means, and that it only protects like women and girls and cisgender women and girls. And so Title IX is actually really broad. It prohibits discrimination based on sex for everyone. And on the basis of sex is very broad. It also means sex stereotypes. So you can't discriminate against students based on sex stereotypes, based on sexual orientation, based on gender identity or trans status, based on sex characteristics. So meaning students who are intersex. It also, as I mentioned earlier, protects students who are pregnant and parenting. It also protects against discrimination for students who have access to an abortion, which of course right now is a very timely issue. And so I think the kind of going back to how it's such a broad statute, I think many of the misconceptions are around like how broad it is, and that it is much broader than people realize. I think another is that, and this kind of goes to the backlash that we've been seeing, especially recently, is that Title IX isn't necessary. Like some people view it as like, well, there's already equity in schools. There are more women and girls in colleges and universities, and we're graduating from, college and university, and they're doing well. And, but that couldn't be further from the truth. Discrimination shows up in so many different ways. And, again, I know we'll cover that more in this conversation, but there is such a need for restoring protections under Title IX and for strengthening it. We have come pretty far in the last 50 years, but we have a lot further to go to obtain true gender equity in schools.
Thank you for that, Shawali. I'm actually going to bring Katie in really quickly because you said something that I think her work can answer. When you talk about the protections that students have, thinking about sex in a very general way, Katie, what should that look like from a K-12 perspective? Many of the people who join us and who are part of our coalition, they do work with people under the age of 18, for example. So what should parents, advocates, and others be looking for within a K-12 school building?
Sure. So first of all, thank you very much for having me today. I'm delighted to be able to be here with Gwen's Girls and all the amazing work that you all do. I think it goes back to Shawali's point about the importance of schools understanding what Title IX is really about, right? I mean, yes, it is. This is actually part of what I use in my training. It's 37 words, but then you have school districts and you have colleges and universities trying to write policy based on those 37 words. And it gets very confusing and it gets very challenging, especially when you're talking about trying to translate policy in a way for parents and advocates, and frankly, even teachers to understand what they need to be doing. So my first answer would be, making it so, particularly in the K-12 space, teachers and counselors and advocates understand what protections are there for the students. I think that's part of the first important piece. If a student comes home and says, X happened to me at school, whatever that might be, the parent doesn't want to have to scramble around and try to read through 17-page policies on a website to figure out who to contact or who to call or what the next step is. So that's always my advice to K-12 spaces, is make this as easily accessible as possible for your parents, for your advocates, and for your students, quite frankly, because you may have high school age students who don't want to have to go home and tell a parent about something that happened, but they want to be able to get to a resource so they can not have to be in the same classroom with a student, or not have to be on the same bus with a student, or whatever the case may be. So I think accessibility to the heart of what Title IX is, which is that protection and that accessibility to the educational opportunity, that's the key that we have to make sure people understand and can access.
I love that. Thank you so much, accessibility. So I'm going to jump back to Shawali now, because you kind of were headed in this direction, which is, what are the critical needs moving forward? What will Title IX look like, hopefully, in its implementation over the next 50 years?
Yeah, this is such a big question. I mean, I think at this point, and we've been having conversations with other advocates about this, Kenya and I work pretty closely in our advocacy. This is really a time that we need to restore protections that have been weakened, and also strengthen the statute itself to kind of solidify these protections so they don't flip-flop between administrations. So to give some context, there has been, so the Department of Education is one of the main federal agencies that enforces Title IX, and they do it separately from the court. So the Department of Ed, if you have a complaint of sex discrimination, anyone can file a complaint with their Office for Civil Rights, and they'll open up an investigation. What they can do is, their end result, I guess, it could be removing funding from a school, but that's never happened. They always get them to agree to certain changes in their policies and practices to ensure students are protected from discrimination. And that process, the administrative process, the Department of Ed's review, is very different from what happens when you file a complaint in court, with the judge, and you file it through a lawsuit. So to guide them, the Department of Ed for decades has created policies. They've issued policies, guidance in the past, they've called them Dear Colleague letters that really explain what these 37 words under Title IX mean when it comes to, let's say, harassment. What are the steps schools actually have to take? Because it's not spelled out in the statute itself. But the guidance is so critical to make sure that schools understand how they're supposed to comply with Title IX. And also so students and their families know what their rights are. And over the last decade, due much to, advocacy from students to survivors, including the founders of NREAP on campus, and other organizations, pushing the Department of Ed to do more when it came to sexual assault, because there was guidance that was in place since the late 90s, but there wasn't much enforcement of it. Students were experiencing high levels of harassment that has continued through the decades. And so, they pushed the department, other advocates, law professors included, to do something about it, to make sure schools are actually responding appropriately to harassment. And through their efforts in 2011 and 2014, the Department of Ed issued guidance, clarifying what an investigation or, how an investigation should be done or hearing in a way that's equitable, how schools are supposed to offer supportive measures and accommodations, when schools should be responding when they know about sexual harassment, what steps they should take and what those standards would be. And that led to a lot more enforcement by the Department of Ed. More complaints were being filed. That was a good sign. That meant that students knew that they had rights and that they trusted the federal government to enforce them. But then unfortunately, after all this enforcement and greater understanding of rights, even though schools were still getting it wrong and there were a lot of problems with how they were not addressing sexual harassment, there emerged this backlash by men's rights advocates and other groups, kind of, around the same time we were seeing this backlash against the Me Too, the hashtag Me Too becoming viral a few years ago. And around this time, or soon after, the Trump administration came into power. And when Betsy DeVos took over the Department of Education in 2017, they rolled back civil rights protections against a lot of different communities. She started by rescinding guidance addressing protections for trans students that wasn't even in effect for a year. And then later that year rescinded that guidance from 2011 and 2014 and started the process to change the Department of Education's regulations addressing sexual harassment. And they made changes that were finalized in 2020, which unfortunately are law. They're still in effect. And these changes were largely made in consultation with men's rights advocates. The Nation did some reporting showing how groups like the National Coalition for Men, FACE, SAVE, these are groups who have been on the fringes because of their positions and how extreme they've been, have had meetings and have had input and have had access to the Trump administration to roll back critical protections under Title IX. And I'll share a link to that article in the chat. But so that led to the Trump administration scaling back protections, forcing schools to ignore complaints of sexual harassment if they weren't considered severe, pervasive, or objectively offensive, to ignore complaints if the harassment didn't occur within an education program or activity. So like, at an off-campus party, even if the survivor had to see their assailant in class and be re-traumatized and triggered. Ultimately, what they did is they allowed, and in some cases, forced schools to sweep sexual harassment further under the rug. And if they were allowed to investigate or have a hearing, imposed unfairly burdensome procedures. One that got a lot of attention is requiring direct live cross-examination for colleges and universities, which only chill reporting and which are not required to get to the truth of what happened. There are lots of different ways that schools have been able to allow parties to question each other without going through something so traumatic. And also in this case, unfair, like direct live cross and how it was implemented. So these rules are in place now. And at the same time, I've talked about the courts. We've seen courts have also weakened protections against harassment, ultimately making it harder for students who have complaints to access justice in the courts. In a way that actually has made it harder for students under Title IX than employees under Title VII. Title VII is another civil rights law that provides protections against harassment, including sexual harassment against employees. But the way the courts have set it up, starting, with the Supreme Court in the late 90s, is they require students to have to allege that they've experienced something more severe. They allow schools to ignore reports that aren't made to the right individual. Basically, it's just the standards are more burdensome, which is quite perverse when you think, why would we want students, including young people, to have to endure something more traumatic and severe in order to get any help in the courts? And then you have what's happening in the States, and I think one great example is all the attacks against trans youth and accessing gender affirming care or restrooms and locker rooms according to their gender identity, or participating in sports according to their gender identity. Like this year has seen a record number of bills and laws that have been passed targeting trans youth, and this is only going to continue. So there has just been a backlash and attacks on protections against sex discrimination in many different ways. And this is why, we need to restore protections through the Title IX rule. I mentioned the Trump rule. One important step is for the Biden administration, which they began about a month ago. They proposed changes to the Title IX rule to undo much of what the Trump administration did, and to also solidify protections for LGBTQI+ students, to make very clear that they are protected against sex discrimination. We hope that they go further and make clear that this includes athletics, given, all the attacks we're seeing in the States, and to also solidify protections for pregnant and parenting students. This is an important step, but this is just the beginning. Again, like the Trump rule stays in effect until the rulemaking process ends. And so this is an opportunity now for everyone to submit comments until September 12th. And I'm going to put in the link, our explainer on these changes. They're very detailed, and they they address what the current policy is and then what these changes would do. In addition to changing the Title IX rule, we need to change the statute itself. There's like the Title IX statute that governs what courts do, and these protections have been weakened by courts. We have to restore, what Title IX's intent is as a broad statute, and and so this is time for a legislative fix to also ensure that these standards, like on addressing harassment, are not so burdensome for students. And to also, and by also cementing these protections in the statute, it would prevent future, hopefully not Trump administrations or other, administrations from undoing whatever changes Biden puts into place. So I would say these are the two big steps: regulatory and statutory changes, which are not easy and simple, but which are very necessary to restoring Title IX's purpose.
Yeah, well, thank you for that call to action. We often say that the Black Girls Equity Alliance, we rest in solutions to systemic failures. And so what good is it to identify an issue without also pointing to probable solutions? And so thank you for both of those suggestions, Shawali, and ways that we can get involved. But I will say that I was today's years old when I heard the phrase men's rights organization. That sounds a bit redundant, living in a patriarchal and misogynistic society. It's a little like saying water is wet. So the last question I have for Shawali before we go to Katie is, and you've touched on this a bit, but I'm wondering if you can kind of just sum things up about this recent push away from bodily autonomy. How do you see that aligning or not with Title IX, and any recommendation for advocates as it relates to K through college education around pregnant, parenting young people, as well as sexual assault, etc.?
Yeah, I think, one important avenue for advocacy right now is submitting a comment to the Biden administration. So I put in the link, an explainer on the proposed changes that not only covers harassment and LGBTQI plus protections, but also provides much needed clarification around how schools are supposed to support pregnant parenting students. The regs haven't changed with respect to pregnant parenting students since they were first issued in 1975. And yet we know that a lot of schools are not providing these students the support that they need to feel supported and to actually succeed in school. And so, under Title IX, this prohibition on sex discrimination, as I mentioned, is broad. It includes discrimination based on a student's pregnancy, termination of pregnancy, childbirth, and recovery from any of these conditions. And so while Title IX does not guarantee nor prohibit abortion access for students, it does grant students the right to learn in an environment free from discrimination based on their decision to obtain an abortion. So again, given the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs, this has become a more critical piece for us to raise awareness on, that this means that schools can't remove someone from an educational program or activity just because they sought, obtained, or are recovering from an abortion. But I'm not gonna, sugarcoat it. These are scary times, like even with these ongoing protections against sex discrimination. And for students, especially young girls of color, they're caught in a double bind. On the one hand, their state legislators were determined to deny them access to comprehensive sex education, right? I know that's an issue that Gwen's Girl works on, and a range of other reproductive health care, including birth control and abortion. But on the other hand, if they become pregnant and they decide to parent, they're ostracized and pushed out of the classroom by an unsupportive school community. And it's our view very firmly that students deserve to make personal decisions about their bodies and lives, including when and if they choose to get pregnant or have an abortion, and that schools should instead be supporting them instead of punishing them. And we will be, providing, we have in our explainer the resources about the changes for pregnant parenting students. Again, I think this comment period is an opportunity to provide comment to the Department of Education, about those protections, and, if there's anything specific to say in light of the Dobbs decision. And the proposed rule came out the day before the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs came out. So, that wasn't addressed in the NPRM, but I definitely think, it's now important to consider when we're weighing on the Title IX rule changes.
Thank you so much, Shawali, for casting that umbrella. And I know I personally appreciate it because my mother was 16 and pregnant with me, 17 when she gave birth. And the school attempted to push her out and do exactly what you just said. My grandparents had to fight for her remaining in school, and she was an honor student, you know, 3.8 GPA graduate, but nevertheless, they saw her as a pregnant Black girl and felt that she didn't deserve to remain in school under Title IX. And Kip said, Shawali, this is so important what you are saying about our female students in situations after jobs and what's to come, and how this impacts our school nurses, which is a really good point as well. Shawali, we'll get back to you in just one moment. We are going to bring up Katie Pope. And I just want to start with Katie, you sharing more about what your role is. I know when I was in college, I did not know that your office or your position existed. So that could be very helpful to our community.
Right. So I think that's a big piece, especially, you know, as Shawali was talking about the history of Title IX, those changes that came about during the Obama administration really made a difference because suddenly schools had to clearly identify who the Title IX coordinator was for the institution. And for Pitt, that's me. So that's, you know, I have this big long title, but I am the Title IX coordinator. And my job is to make sure that we are adhering to the rules and expectations under Title IX. What that means in real life, day to day, is that my office is the office where if a student or an employee is having an issue related to Title IX, or in our case, Title VII as well, among other things, they can come to us, report what's happening, get supportive measures, get some solutions, and decide whether or not they want to move forward with any kind of investigative process or not. I think it's important that people understand, you know, with Title IX, that students K12 up higher ed can come through and ask for supportive measures without having to go into an investigative process. Also, often that's something that prevents people from speaking up or seeking support. And it's always important to know that you don't have to do that. These offices are here first and foremost to get the student or the employee safely and promptly back into the educational or workspace. That's the first line of the job. And then all the other pieces come after that, and they come with the decision-making of the person who came forward, because we want them to have agency in how the process is going to work for them. So sorry, did that answer the question? I feel like I got off on a tear there.
Perfect. That's
Okay.
perfect. Thank you. But I know also, Katie, you have an extensive background in this work. And as I was reading your bio, I saw a phrase that I was unfamiliar with, which is sexual assault prevention education. Let us know what that is, and also how school districts can support that work, because that seems to be so incredibly important.
Right. So sexual assault prevention education, and again, this is back to, you know, the things that are covered in all the various different rules that come out about Title IX, right? And whichever way the pendulum is swinging under which administration, it's highlighted or not highlighted. But what we know from the work that's out there, some of it being done by a lot of good folks here in Pittsburgh, is that prevention education is essential to addressing sexual assault, sexual harassment on campus. And prevention education is not risk reduction. So it's not the make sure you walk in pairs at night. Make sure you check your drink before you take it from the bar. You know, those types of things that you often hear and are often messaged about ways to prevent sexual assault. Prevention is really getting our students to talk about consent, to talk about and understand what consent is, to talk about how to have a healthy relationship with a partner, you know, to talk about how to be able to say yes and no when you're having sexual relations with someone, and to not be afraid to have those conversations. So prevention education is a key component. And I think it's frankly easier in higher ed to have those conversations because you're talking about sex. I mean, that's the reality of it, right? You're talking about physical intimacy. Whereas in K through 12 spaces, you know, as Gwen's Girls knows from the work you're doing in sex education in the schools, it's often harder to have those conversations in that K-12 space. But it's essential to getting students to know, you know, if they feel in their gut something's wrong, or that what's happening isn't what they want, giving them the confidence to say no, or to know how to, you know, remove themselves from a situation, especially knowing the incidents of violence that can happen for women when they do try to remove themselves from a dangerous situation. So, you know, prevention is about talking about what happens before, and how can you really prevent those assaults from happening. I mean, obviously it's not foolproof, right? It's not 100%, but we feel it's a very important part of the conversation for our students, to get them to understand the climate and really build their agency and ability to say yes or no in a situation.
Yeah, and I feel like this conversation around prevention equaling conversations regarding consent, I wrote that down, it's so powerful. It removes the onus and the responsibility from the person who is a possible victim, right? Because too often it is the person who has suffered the harm or will potentially suffer the harm that
Right.
is the one that has the responsibility in the situation. And it should definitely be the other way around.
Absolutely. And that's why the risk reduction piece can get so frustrating at times, right? Because it's sort of always that, well, don't do this. Well, don't do this. Well, don't do this. And that, as you say, that can very much make someone feel like, oh, I'm the one that screwed up. I'm the one, you know, and they then doubly feel harm and guilt, quite frankly, because they, you know, they're afraid to come forward after something happens.
Yeah. And you mentioned it being easier to have these conversations at the university level, but how do we have them in a K-12 space? Like, what is your opinion on that, especially with so much blowback right now around comprehensive sex ed?
Yeah, and I mean, it's a tough situation. I don't have if I had a magic wand, this is one of the things I would wave it for, to be perfectly honest. One thing that we've seen effective, not only in the college space, but in a few high schools that I have had some contact with, is peer education. So getting, you know, a peer team that's trained and educated, you know, with some sort of professional leader, whether that's a counselor or a teacher, a nurse, whatever, or someone from an outside agency, you know, like Gwen's Girls or PAR or something like that, who can help lead conversation. We know that these conversations are more effective when peers are involved. There's more comfort for students to talk to other students about these issues. So that would certainly be one way that I would see. You know, I don't think that could work at the elementary level. I'm not very familiar with that group, but I would say middle school to high school could be that could be a great way to not only talk about this, but sex education as well.
I love that. And that actually is a great transition to Kenyora, who does this work around peer education. So thank you so much, Katie. We'll come back to you in just a moment. But right here, I want to pause to see if anyone has questions, comments. I see Kip dropped in the chat. When I was teaching middle school in PPS, PAR did regular educational classes on sexual assault every year, 2 or 3 sessions with each group of kids. And PAR, I believe, stands for Pittsburgh Advocates Against Rape. Y'all correct me if I'm wrong, but just for folks who are not local.
Pittsburgh Action Against Rape.
Action, thank you, against rape, for folks who are not local and may not know. So Kenyora, am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Oh, perfectly. Thank you.
Magic going. I knew I was saying it right. All right. So you have a very, very important role as executive director of End Rape on Campus, or EROC for short. Tell us a bit more about your work.
Absolutely. So first, I just want to say thank you so much to Shara for this invitation, for being in this space with Shwali and Katie, and for being a speaker for Gwen's Girls and Black Girls Equity Alliance. I've been thinking a lot about this question because for me, I think not only is it important to work directly with impacted populations in this work, but it's important to ensure that they're the ones at the table where decisions are being made about their communities. You can't make a decision about a population or a community, especially if you're not from there. You have to understand where people are coming from, what they're working with, what is not working well, and finding a solution to make things better and not worse. And for us, student survivors are at the intersections of their identities and their experiences, and especially when it comes to sexual assault, are not monolithic. They're not the same, and there's no one size fits all. So with respect to our founding as NRAPE on Campus in 2013, almost 10 years ago, it was founded by then students, Annie E. Clark and Andre L. Pino Silva from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and Sophia Karesk from the University of California, Berkeley. So two opposite sides of the United States coming together and really connecting after they learned about each other's harrowing experiences of sexual assault, interpersonal violence, and the unfortunate subsequent dismissal response that their respective universities had provided, or should I say did not provide. And so they strategically came together to show that campus sexual assault is a nationwide epidemic. It's not a problem that is contained, especially in one particular region or school. And so that's how EROC really began its national advocacy work. And then what they did is with students, they helped students filing federal complaints against universities and publicly announcing these filings at student coordinated national press conferences and highlighting the systemic indifference to sexual assault on campuses across the country. Currently now, our mission essentially is we work to end campus sexual assault by providing support for survivors in their communities, prevention through education and policy reform from the campus to the federal levels by centering historically excluded and systemically marginalized communities. We feel as though that's very important to have as part of our mission and have it be weaved and threaded through as part of what we call our Centering the Margins framework. And that aim is really to fill the disparities of resources for students who are at the intersections of their identities and really amplify their voices. And over the past decade or so, and even most recently, we have seen students, survivors of campus sexual assault really band together and come together like never before. In this past academic year at the start, it is known as what is called the red zone. And the red zone is a time in which more than 50% of sexual assault occurs once they start from campus all the way through Thanksgiving break. This past year was certainly intensified because of the new students that were arriving on campus. And when I say new students, I mean not just freshman students, but also the sophomores who didn't have the chance to experience coming onto campus because they were still in that COVID period in the 2020-2021 year. And so they were coming back to campus for the first time, experiencing what it's like to have that college life, as well as even transfer students who were coming in. And so this past year, we essentially dubbed the name the double red zone to really show the impact of that. And we were not kidding when we said that there was going to be a double red zone. We actually saw a number of students who came together stand up against their colleges because of the mishandling of sexual assaults that were happening. And this happened across the country. About 300 protests from not just colleges, but also high schools of students really banding together. And so we and rape on campus, along with our coalition partners like that of National Women's Law Center and several other partners, came together really with students on a campaign that we called #EdActNow. And that campaign was also a petition where we were able to garner over 55,000 signatures from students, lawyers, advocates, parents, really calling on the U.S. Department of Education to restore student survivors' rights and making college campuses safer by acting now back then to change Title IX regulations, which is what Shwali had spoke to about the recent publication of the drafted proposed Title IX regulations that just occurred last month. And so for us, it's really about not only working with students, but working with student survivors who are at the intersections. They are the heart of this work. They are at the center of this, and they deserve to have, an education that's free from sexual violence. Yeah.
Thank you. I told you the work was inspiring. It is absolutely inspiring. And I think many of us, Gwen's Girls is actually hosting our 7th annual Equity Summit very soon, it's next month, and all around youth engagement and youth voice. But many of us are working to ensure that young people are engaged in an authentic way around the issues that impact their daily lives. Give us some tips on how to do so. How has EROC been able to do such great work with young people and survivors at the core?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the first thing I want to say is we have to meet young people, especially the student survivors, and student survivors are at the intersections of their identities with where they're at currently. We have to let young people guide us in how they wish to engage through whether it's active listening and validation, simply just being there and being a helpful ear. But I also think that we have to be mindful of what the different needs are, the different stressors that occur, the different coping mechanisms that may exist, ways of handling trauma that needs to be met with not only cultural sensitivity, but also with respect. And I would also say giving students the tools and resources and leadership skills to navigate through, what they've experienced, whether it's campus sexual assault, domestic violence, or interpersonal violence. Because what we're also talking about is the fact that sexual assault is actually a public health crisis, and that needs to be addressed as such. And by doing that, I think within our educational system, it's, having lessons on not just the civil rights movement, but all types of intersectional rights that give these students a framework on understanding not only American history, but also global history, and how there are different folks around the world who are also affected by this issue. And I would also say, including tools that help them build critical and civic literacy. Civil rights is a living movement, and that means that all students and all of us should be learning and thriving and have all of the access to resources and tools that we need in order to navigate through what is a traumatic experience. And so one of the things that NRAPE on campus does, well, a couple of things I want to mention is, and first and foremost, is our Student Survivor Caucus. Our Student Survivor Caucus is what we piloted this past academic year, and we're headed into year 2 for this academic year, where we're bringing together students who are at the intersections of their identities, whether they're undergrad or graduate level students, really to the table. We're building a table with these students. And it's through that table of which we provide tools, best practices that are centered on 3 pillars. And those 3 pillars are survivorship and wellness, sexual assault awareness and education, and social and political activism. We believe that it's important to put the tools in the hands of the students in order for them to feel empowered to make change on their college campuses and beyond within their communities. And so they are receiving support from us as EROC staff in the development and execution of their own organizing skills and advocacy efforts, whether it's a campus action that happens or maybe a more national action action that we may put together. For example, during this past Sexual Assault Awareness Month in April, our first cohort had actually shared out their list of demands that they believe that schools should be listening to. And those things included everything from not just resources, but also talking about students who are at the intersection of their identities, like that of students with disabilities, students who are coming from LGBTQ communities, communities of color, and even undocumented first generation and immigrant students. So it's really about making sure that we're putting the tools, in the hands of the students who are our next generation of leaders who will be leading us. Because without that, like, how can we call them our next generation of leaders if we're not setting them up for success? So that's what we believe in there. Absolutely.
Thank you. Your work and just what you shared reminds me of former Black Panther Jalil Muta King, who said, "We are our own liberators." And so it sounds like it's setting the expectation that young people can indeed change systems and policies and practices and programs, again, as the ones who have been impacted by various forms of sexual violence. So thank you, Kenyora. We will get back to you in just 1 minute. I want to bring up Dr. Brittany Brinkman because there's actually a really great conversation happening in the chat that I feel like Dr. Brinkman can help us to highlight. First, it was a question from Ted that says, in the K-12 environment, if anyone on the call knows, how do the Title IX requirements for prevention education stack against the district sex education policy and existing standards? And that's exactly what the Black Girls Equity has been working on under Jose Garth and Brittany Brinkman's leadership of our health and wellness work group. So I will kick it to you to give us an update and to also answer Ted's question.
Yeah, thanks for tagging me in here. So Ted, thanks for this question. I'm really glad that you brought it up. So in the health and wellness group and with others in BGA, we have been working for years, actually since 2018, really targeted to work with PPS around sexual harassment prevention and sex education, because we know these things are really connected, right? And so we need to be thinking about comprehensive sex ed is part of how we do prevention for sexual harassment and sexual violence, sexual assault. So, so we've been really working on both of these things. Occasionally, with policy, sometimes there's like this policy for this thing, this policy for this thing. But from our perspective, they really do need to be connected together. So we spent about a year working with PPS in 2019, looking at the sexual harassment policy at the time, which, was written so that it was like meeting Title IX standards, but we had some questions about implementation and also some questions about how that could be better connected to prevention and sex education. And so we have actually worked to create this revised policy, and that policy does connect directly with how we are thinking about violence prevention and sex education. So I think as a group, we have already had the discussion of like coming back to PPS's policy about sexual harassment, sexual violence, and supporting that revision process there. And really, I think exactly what you're saying in your question in the chat, making sure that those things are collaborative and working together. That as a school system, we shouldn't be talking about sex ed over here and sexual violence over here, right? Like it's really, I think, a comprehensive approach is what's going to work best. So I think that we've gotten some traction and support in doing that work and updating some policies. As everyone on the call has spoken to, policy is really, really important, but so is implementation and programming. So I think that support as well. So how do we have good policies? How do we have access and dissemination to the policies so that any person in the system can access them? And then how do we also make sure that those are the policies that are being implemented through prevention and intervention? So.
Thank you, Brittany. And just while we have you, don't go anywhere.
Yeah.
One more question.
Yeah.
I know that we've also done a bit of research and data collection around student experiences with sexual harassment. Can you speak to that a bit?
Yes, absolutely. So unfortunately, even given, PPS having written policies saying, that sexual harassment is not tolerated, what we found in our study that we conducted locally was that most of the girls in the study are experiencing sexual harassment at school in a variety of settings, in classrooms, in hallways, through transportation. And unfortunately, for the most part, the response from people in the school has not been helpful. There were some cases of an adult who was really supportive, but a lot of girls are reporting that they are being told, a boy is only doing that because he likes you, or it was your fault for how you were behaving or what you were wearing. They're being blamed. They're not being really heard about their experiences. Experiences are often minimized and dismissed. We also know that girls reported the negative effects of sexual harassment. So it's fairly pervasive, but it's not like an experience that just because it's happening a lot, people are used to it, right? It is impacting our girls in particular, and especially Black girls in the school. So girls are reporting that they don't want to go to school. They're having a hard time focusing in school. Black girls in particular reported that they actually are getting in trouble when they experience sexual harassment, that if they report it or if they defend themselves in some way, maybe someone's been harassing them for weeks and they finally sort of yell at somebody or physically remove them from touching their body, and Black girls report that they actually end up getting in trouble instead of the person who's been harassing them. We know sometimes girls are missing school because they just can't stand having to go to school and being harassed by the same person that's been harassing them. So it is an existing problem. So it's good to have, like I said, it's good to have policies that say the right thing. But what our young people are telling us is that sexual harassment is definitely still happening, and they need more education and more supports for prevention and better intervention from adults in the school.
Yeah, thank you for that. And as you were speaking, Brittany, I can't help but to think about the work of Dr. Jamelia Burke and others around adultification bias, right? Jamelia Blake, I'm sorry, around adultification bias and how this rampant sexual harassment that girls are facing, especially Black girls, is not taken seriously because they're seen as knowing more about sex or being hypersexual than they actually are. So thank you for bringing that to the forefront.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that is part of the problem. We also know that a lot of the kids in our study said that they are being blamed, and then they're being told it's being connected to things around inappropriate language about dress codes. This idea that, well, if you didn't dress that way, boys wouldn't harass you, and then them being sexualized through the dress code. So I think that adultification bias is part of the problem, and this sort of assumption of treating children as if they're adults, which, by the way, people shouldn't sexually harass adults either. So, but I think it is part of what's going on is absolutely this idea that this bias leads adults to be less likely to offer care and support and nurturing to Black girls when they are asking for help.
And one last thing, are we seeing this just with students, or is this also coming from adults in the building targeting young people?
Oh yeah, unfortunately, the people perpetrating sexual harassment is across the board. And, in my work in this area, in Pittsburgh and in other places, we know that when there's like a system that perpetuates the idea of gender inequality and sexualization of girls and women, then girls and our most marginalized girls are at most at risk. So in schools where adults are sexually harassing each other, as well as sexually harassing students, or where they are engaging in sexism against women and gender non-conforming people in the school, then that's like what the kids are learning, right? They're directly being modeled. This is where some of the dress code stuff comes in. The ways that some people enforce dress code policies is incredibly sexualized. Adults are touching girls' bodies, they're making sexualized comments to girls. So not only is it itself a form of sexual harassment, it is modeling to boys in the school that that's an appropriate way to interact with girls and women, that it's like policing them is being taught. So it is absolutely a problem that's happening across the board. Certainly there are boys who are not sexually harassing girls, and there are teachers who are not sexually, but the amount that it is happening, I think, is really problematic.
Thank you for that, Brittany. Such an important conversation. I'm so happy that you've done this work to highlight what's happening in PPS and Allegheny County writ large. We have our health and wellness work group meeting. Is it next week, Britt?
It is next week. Let's see, I can look at it on my calendar. Yes, it is the third, Wednesday the 3rd from 3 to 4:30.
So if folks are interested, please join us. And also, yes, Shawali put in the chat asking if we have a report on this. We certainly do.
Yes.
And Shawali also shared a resource that National Women's Law Center put together with GGE on school district policies to prevent and better respond to sexual harassment, and it responds or addresses comprehensive sex education. So
yeah, and we published an article also from the study, so I'll drop all that into the chat for everybody.
okay, thank you, Britt.
Yeah.
So let's bring our panelists back up, please, Amy, so we can continue our conversation, because I asked all of you the same question, and I would like for us to go around and answer this, and it is, what is your biggest piece of advice for community advocates, parents, teachers, and schools? And feel free to maybe take one segment of the population out of there as you see necessary. But what is your biggest piece of advice for those groups of folks seeking to end gender-based violence in schools?
I don't mind going first here. And I'll speak, I guess, for parents on that topic. And I would say, if anything, first and foremost, if for anyone who's in the room who's a parent and has a child who has disclosed that they have just been sexually assaulted, I think first and foremost, just being there, validating and believing your child is the most critical first step, period. And I think then I would say, with their consent and with their permission, asking them what it is that they would like to do and how they would like to proceed and how they would like to navigate through that. And I say that to say is because I think a lot of parents like to say, oh my gosh, this is what happened, and go jump right immediately into action, which can be a good thing or a bad thing. But sometimes I think what a child really needs is to first process what they've just experienced, especially if we're talking about K-12 students, but also college students who are also trying to figure out what just happened to them, because a lot of older students also sometimes are just unsure as to what they've experienced, and don't have the words to experience, to describe what they've experienced, because we've had these multiple definitions of what is sexual assault versus sexual harassment versus sexual violence. And so we're still navigating through those definitions ourselves, even as advocacy folks, because there are a myriad of different nuances that occur with respect to sexual violence. And so I would say definitely meeting your child where they're at, what their needs are. And of course, therapy is definitely another great tool to add to their toolbox, but not just for your child, but also for yourself too. Because I think what parents may not realize is that secondary trauma is also a real thing, especially when someone discloses something very traumatic. And so making sure that parents also seek the help and support that they need in order to help support their child is important. And then what I would also say is, for any parent who is getting their high school child ready to navigate through the college space, when you're going on a virtual or in-person campus tour, or if your student was admitted on admitted students day, asking questions of faculty, staff about who their Title IX coordinator is. Well, how do they respond when it comes to sexual assault experiences? And just really getting into the heart and nitty gritty of what that looks like. You probably would be surprised about how many college staff and faculty may not have that information. But I hope that they do their best by you and, get the information you need, or at least point you to the person who's responsible for that. But then also what I would say is, for any parents who are looking for a community of other parents whose child has experienced campus sexual assault, there is a community called Parents Take Action to End Rape on Campus, or PTA EROC. They are a community of parents who our founders had helped to support their creation and evolution of their own 501c3 to establish this community of parents. And what they do is they simply support other parents who are going through the process, help them walk through Title IX, and really provide some insight as to how they navigated through it all. So you can find their information at pta.org, and I'll put that in the chat as well for that resource. But even if you just need another ear to lean on and to hear you, they're there to support parents.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy you started with parents, because I do think that they are often left out of this conversation. So thank you. Katie, let's go to you.
Okay. And I just have to say, Kenura, yes, I would be delighted to know how many staff and faculty can answer that question when it is asked of them, even on Pitt's campus. So it's always, education is the biggest challenge, quite frankly, in this space, I feel often. And so I would say, especially thinking about what Brittany shared, I would say for schools, or maybe for advocates, because sometimes the schools won't do it, is to find a way to take those policies and make sure that you have people on the ground who know what to do. And I know I spoke earlier about the importance of accessibility and knowing who to contact, but the point is very real. If the person you contact doesn't know what to do, doesn't know how to help, doesn't know how to be supportive, then nothing's going to happen. Nothing's going to change for that student who had the courage to come forward and say, this happened to me. So maybe it's for advocates to, talk to school boards and say, how are your people trained? Who trains your staff on how to respond to report of sexual assault or sexual harassment, or any of these categories that we've been talking about? How are they trained? How often are they trained? What does it look like? So getting those questions answered so that that in that school district there are people who can respond, and preferably respond with some level of competency for all different populations in all different communities, and not just ignore, to the point, if a young Black student comes forward and says something, ignore it because they think it's not, isn't relevant. Or if an international student comes forward, ignore it because they think, oh, there's different cultural standards. This isn't the same. So I think that would be one of the biggest tips I would say, is get in there and find out what's really happening between the writing of the policy and the implementation with the individuals. The other thing I'll just add quickly, if I can, is that the snowball effect here is that then these students go on to college, and we know that students who come to college who experience sexual assault typically have experienced before in their K-12 setting, or as a younger student, and how that experience impacted them indicates how willing they're going to be to come forward and seek help when they're experiencing something like this in college. So if they don't have the support, the snowball effect just gets worse and worse, and they don't have that security or confidence to come forward and talk to someone to try to get the support and resources that they need.
Yeah, and hearing you say that, Katie, just reminds me that I can't think of an area where poor implementation can have the most dangerous results. And so going to an office or going to someone in a building and you've been assaulted in this way and seeking help and not having your needs be met, it has this, I would imagine, extreme chilling effect that really can be an additional form of trauma.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And Shawali, we'll turn to you.
I think what I would add is, there's such great resources in the chat, sorry. And this is kind of related to our 100 school districts report that I share that we developed with Girls for Gender Equity. And it's I think for anyone who wants to push their schools to change their policies, I think, EROC is a great example of student organizing leading to change, on campuses, but also with the federal government. And There are groups that are also working with communities in K12 schools and school districts. And, Kenya mentioned earlier, there have been so many protests at middle schools, high schools, colleges, and universities. Like, students and their families are fed up. And, it is an important opportunity to push schools to change their policies. And so we hope that the toolkit that I shared is helpful. It provides several recommendations. It addresses comprehensive sex education as really the best way of preventing gender-based violence, right? And it being comprehensive, LGBTQI plus inclusive. We also talk in there about dress codes and the harm with having dress codes and how they perpetuate myths about sexual violence and how they're unfairly applied against girls of color, in particular Black girls. The toolkit also talks about the need for better education, better training, because the implementation piece is huge. If you have these policies, but school employees and students don't know about them, then what use are they? And then we also discuss the retaliation. Like, that is a huge issue, and I'm very interested to review the report that Gwen's Girls has worked on, that was mentioned earlier, that Brittany mentioned earlier, because school push out and retaliation is a huge issue that we're seeing over and over again. And it's, our toolkit addresses how schools need to have amnesty policies and policies that ensure students will not be punished when they come forward. And that's something that we had urged the Biden administration to focus on in their Title IX rulemaking. There is some clarification about retaliation and some mention of peer-on-peer retaliation as well. So kind of related to my second point is, I mentioned the NPRM. This is also an opportunity with the comment period until I think September 12th to let the Department of Education know how you feel and what changes you want them to make to the Title IX rules. NWLC has a public, I'll put the link to our public comment for anyone who wants to just join, a short sign-on comment. And yes, so those are the two things that I would highlight.
Thank you so much, Shawali. Does anyone have any questions for our panelists? Any thoughts? Anything that popped up for you during today's conversation? We would love to hear from you. Also, as Shawali mentioned, there's some great resources right now in the chat. Please do jump in there as well. And make sure you click those links. And we will make sure they're also in the description box over on YouTube for our webinar recording. Ginger says great information and updates. We are so grateful for you all being part of our community. Once a Gwen's Girl, always a Gwen's Girls. Kenyor, you can't go anywhere. Sorry, you are stuck with us. Shawali knows it. Katie knows it. And we are having our 7th annual Equity Summit in September. Day 1 is virtual. Day 2 is in person at the Sheraton Hotel in Pittsburgh. We would love to invite everyone who's joined us today to come to our summit. The topic is going to be youth voice and youth engagement, as I mentioned. Many of the orgs that have been mentioned today are going to be joining us, including Girls for Gender Equity and their ED, Joanne Smith. And so we would love it if you all stay connected with us. Kip says, thank you all. This is so vital right now. Your insights and resources are invaluable. Gratitude to Gwen's Girls also. I feel the same way, Kip. And so I guess my closing remark is that we know power concedes nothing without a demand. So as Kenyor talked about, the young people making demands, let's continue to go forth and do so. Thank you all so much and have an amazing day. Bye, everybody.